First of all, I want to thank everyone for coming, and I also want to thank our panelists today for joining us for this conversation. Let's give it up for our panelists today. So, and I'm still not sure if there's enough, is there enough sound on that? Okay. Yes. The way we're going to work through this is sort of, I'll just ask some questions initially, and maybe after 35, 40 minutes, we're going to turn it over to questions from the audience and take it from there. We should be done in about an hour. That's sort of the normal goal we have. Let me kind of start out by really make us thinking about sort of what's the topic for today, protesting. In terms of, if I were to ask you as the audience, sort of what is protest? What is protesting really about? I think most of us would kind of think about, okay, marches, demonstrations, rallies, and then we think about sort of, acts of civil disobedience, right? So we think about occupations, we think about sit-ins, we think about creating blockades, and maybe even going over blockades kind of, as sort of violations actually of the law. But then again, on a different level, we can think about protesting in a more comprehensive, you might even say abstract way, right? So what about consumer protests, like boycotts? We can think about protest in terms of, is non-voting a type of protest? And now we can move it even further, right? We can think about the First Amendment I mentioned today in my class on interest groups, right? We talked about the right to petition to redress the grievances you can make toward government as a foundation of protest, right? So I'm wondering, sort of, does that mean like all kinds of lobbying is actually type of protest? What about, oh my gosh, lawsuits, right? If I have First Amendment rights and think about violations against me on, let's say, religious grounds, and I want to sue the state, is this a kind of protest? I mean, we can go on, but I want to make sure, do we actually sort of have a common sense of where protest, like, I guess not started, but where it actually ends, and maybe are there sensible boundaries of what it means to protest? Anyone? Any takers?
Okay. In my sense, it's one of those very hard words to define, like violence. You can pack in basically anything you want to. I think that we need to be very careful not to cut things off. So for me, what protest is any action or expression intended to express disapproval with the current state of affairs. And so think, for instance, of Martin Luther's tradition. It is the Protestant denomination. This is a protest against the Catholic Church. My sense is if you're using the instruments of power to continue the status quo, this is not protest, but basically anything else is, or else you end up excluding things that we conclude as the are protest. I want to stay general.
Thank you. Are there other thoughts, additions, some little disagreement among the other panelists?
Hello. No.
It's on.
Is it?
Yeah.
Oh. All right. So my basic view of protest is you want to change something for the common good, and that can be skewed in a lot of ways. You can have both political ends of the spectrum seeing what they're doing is wanting political or like common good change, however that's viewed. I think though some people have been using that in different ways, saying what they're doing is right, along with thinking what they're doing is protesting, which you can honestly define protesting in many different ways. But I think there should be a common clear line of, is this protesting or is this burning down a city?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Any additional thoughts or not?
I'm curious, why is burning down a city not protest?
I don't think my property should be at the destruction of other people because I didn't do anything wrong to them, but they believe that my property is going to be destroyed. I think a good example is the group Antifa, or anti-fascist organization. They are commonly known for being a violent, quote-unquote, protesting group, which is, okay, fine, you can burn out a city, and that's all right, but I don't think I should be at the centerfold of my property being destroyed.
Mm-hmm. let me kind of ask you more personal questions, since you all have agreed to be on this panel today. I'm wondering, to what extent, have you had personal experience with protesting, or maybe you have studied protest kind of in a class or courses, or what's your background kind of maybe draws you to really think about and maybe be part of protests?
Sorry my voice goes out, I've been a little bit sick, but I think I have like a very long history of being in protests. The first one I can remember, is this on? Yeah.
Just use stuffs if it's not. They were all working before. So
Testing. It sounds bad.
Not my fault.
I remember in elementary school and being told I couldn't be on the cheerleading team because I was a male. So the first thing I ever did was actually go to every single practice and just go along with them, and they would not, there was a lot of protests against me actually being there. There was saying, no, you can't be there. There was security guards called at once, but every single week, it was Wednesday nights, every single week I would show up and I would not leave, and if they were being really genuine, really nice, really I guess accepting, they would actually let me practice with them for a while before they go to security guards on me. But yeah, I think I grew up in a family that just made sure that protesting was just something that was considered normal, considered something that we were able to do, considered part of our freedom, part of our rights. In high school is when I think I kind of went more into it. I led a lot of protests in my high school. Very different. It was just posting things on social media. Sometimes we will staple flyers to our backs. We have them ripped off our bags before. We had them ripped off our lockers. But so yeah.
Can you mention what those were about? I mean, what was the issue that?
One of the flyers on our back was against slut shaming, so we all had the definition of slut on our back. On posters, on our lockers, it was protesting the dress code. So we had a few different kind of things on that, if I can remember. I can't. I led a few protests against sexual harassment. I've contacted, I went to go to my year high school, which is a public school, part of Milwaukee Public School. So I remember writing a huge letter, 4 pages long, to the superintendent and saying my principal did this, slut shaming a student for wearing a skirt that was too small. We want her to have something on her record, and I consider that a type of protest, because for me, protesting at its most at its core definition is showing disapproval of something.
Well, I think I have minimal actual protest experience. I went to the March for Our Lives protest in Chicago last year, which was about gun control, and I've really gotten into it with my mom because we went to that protest together, and she's gotten really involved with the organization Moms Made Action, which their focus is gun control and keeping their children safe, and she goes to a lot of meetings for them, and then I'll attend meetings with her sometimes. And yeah, but other than actually going out and protesting, I've always just been an outspoken individual, and I post a lot on social media about my beliefs, and whether it be some of what Bren was talking about with dress code, sexual harassment, and other things like LGBT issues, race issues. If there's an injustice, I'd like to speak out about it.
Thank you. I have more confidence in this microphone, so I think we're going to stick to this one here. Do you guys add something about your experiences?
So I've been busy in my time with Griffin. Like a lot of people, graduate school radicalized me politically. So I took part in labor actions, those strikes, and work slowdowns. I picketed for and against various causes, presidents, things like that. I've been chained to a few things. Never been arrested in any cases, but I probably should have been at least once. I've taken over various educational offices, deans, chancellors, and presidents. I once led a sit-in at a state representative's office also. I took part in the Occupy movement of 2011, but not as much as I wish I had, and not in New York City, which I had also. Taken part in one black bloc, but I take part in more, but that's where we are right now.
Can you mention this one case sort of where you think you should have maybe been arrested? What was that about?
My chair is here. I prefer not to do so.
So I haven't had any traditional protesting. I am more of an online activist, as some may call me. A few of my things is I am heavily protesting against anti-vaccines. Vaccinate your kids. It's that simple. Protesting Article 13 in the EU and the copyright laws that are trying to be put in the EU right now, and protesting the new net neutrality ruling repeal. I believe in an open, free internet, and I believe net neutrality is something that we highly need for that. So I wouldn't say I've ever experienced like a go out kind of protest, but I'm actively looking online for stuff and combating misinformation when it comes to that sort of thing.
Thanks, everyone. Before we go into some controversies, I would like to talk a little bit about what you believe really protesting can accomplish. In terms of, I mean, you've already talked about your personal experiences, and maybe you can share a little bit about what came out of it, right? So we can think about, on a national sort of scale, right, we can think about potentially influencing the public, right, public opinion, public's agenda to even think about certain kinds of issues and discuss them, societal kind of debates kind of that can be sparked. But also maybe you can think about more concretely about, on political agendas and even certain possibly policy changes, even at the very sort of local level, be it at a high school or something like this, where you can have authorities who actually suddenly start to say, oh wow, we really need to think about this more closely. We have to really change our policy, right? And so I guess my question really is, how effective can protesting be, based on your personal experience, but also based on sort of observations that you have made by looking at maybe like global or national or state level issues? Sure.
Well, I know for me in high school, I posted a lot on Facebook. I do a little bit more now, but a big thing for me was when I took AP Government, and I was just, at that point there was an election coming up and I couldn't vote, so I wanted to do what I could to get my voice out there. And I think just tying this back into issues now, right now for me the environment's a big issue, and if you look at what people have done with just like what's getting talked about a lot, like I know an issue was straws, and although that is one part of it, I think sometimes protesting goes like the wrong direction. Like with this issue, yes, like straws are an issue, like one-use plastics in general are an issue, but I don't think that's the biggest issue. And some companies like, Starbucks with their new strawless lid is like, oh, we're at the forefront of this, even though that's a very small change. And I think people need to, like, what protesting helps with here is showing, oh, but there's more to do. And I don't think that there'll ever be a time when we're going to be content, because there's always going to be something more to better or to look towards.
Mm-hmm. I think we can still use that. Yeah.
So with going off of what I've said about like protesting my kind of stuff, I've noticed that not much has come from kind of what I've seen. Net neutrality is currently in the midst of being destroyed on a galactic scale. EU just did pass Article 13, and they're losing a lot of rights in that way. And I believe Washington State is seeing record highs of measles outbreak right now. And it kind of amazes me that some protesting really can't affect anything at all sometimes. And I think that's something to accept sometimes when protesting. You may not change things right away, but it doesn't mean you should quit trying to look for that change. I'm still going to be fighting, the net neutrality repeal. I know states are actually fighting it as we speak. They're setting up their own net neutrality. Colorado, I believe California as well. So I think if a protest doesn't go the right way at the beginning, it doesn't mean it's over. You can still try to fight what you're wanting to change.
So I identified 5 different things I think protests can accomplish. One is consciousness raising, to let people know that something is important, something matters, that is an issue worth paying attention to, because if you're going to go out there and make a point to put your body on the line or even spend your time, it probably matters enough to you. Number 2, it can change policy. Think of the anti-war protests in Vietnam, think of the civil rights movement. These are protests that had real outcomes, no doubt about it. It can change the conversation. Before 2011, class politics in the US was kind of dead. Occupy Wall Street, though, reintroduced the possibility of class politics as the 1% versus 99%. Now that we think in those terms more or less automatically, it means Occupy Wall Street had a real effect in the world. It also shows others that one exists, so you can find solidarity with people who believe like you believe and want what you want, who you might never run into anyway. These kind of locations for meeting people who can be your friends and your comrades as well. And lastly, it shows one's own capacity. Back when I was just starting grad school, I was a coward. I was absolutely terrified of stepping out of line at all. I just wanted to follow the rules through and through. The first time I went on a strike, though, I said, wow, I can do that. I have this ability to challenge the system in some limited sense and shows human potentiality in a way that few other activities do. At least those 5.
As from like personal experience, I've seen like a huge protesting being like a huge changer to certain things, especially in my high school. I forgot to also say that I've also been working with nonprofits like G-Save, and also I've worked with Milwaukee, ACLU in some protests, help planning, attending, that kind of stuff. But for my high school one, like I said, we sent something to my superintendent about just things my principal has said. We did get an email back, not a letter, but we got an email back saying my principal would be handled. Like they said there was gonna be a hearing. We did hear back that she had a strike on her record, and she no longer said the things that she was saying to women in our class. But I think like the biggest thing to like judge the success of a protest is, did your message get across? Is it in people's minds? Are people talking about it? And I think like, and of course success can be a lot stronger than that, but I think like if that happens, then you did something right.
Okay, I want to turn the conversation a little bit more towards some controversies. And in fact, I would like to kind of talk a little bit about the current federal administration and sort of some of the comments that have been made more recently. And so, just as an example, if I look at a speech that was given by former Attorney General Jeff Sessions, I don't want to misquote him, so I'll just say kind of what he said about campus protests. He talked about he spoke out for freedom of thought and speech on American campus, which he believes is under threat these days. This important value is under threat. He decried how, I'm quoting him, protesters are now routinely shutting down speeches and debates across the country in an effort to silence the voices that insufficiently conform with their views. And in fact, President Trump has recently signed an executive order where he said, if the university doesn't allow you to speak, we will not give them money. Very simple. He said, again, I'm quoting him, today we're delivering a clear message to the professors and power structures that trying to suppress dissent and keeping young Americans and all Americans, not just young Americans, from challenging rigid far-left ideology. So going back to this point about protesters shutting down speech on campuses in America, do you agree with the view that former Attorney General Jeff Sessions presents here?
So I don't believe someone who's speaking should get shut down. I think if a college wants to bring them in, no matter who it is, left or right leaning, they should be able to speak. I also believe it is the student's right to go out and protest that speech. I think a good example is Beloit College, not very far from here. I believe the Blackwater chairman was going to speak, and the students protested that. That was their right. All they did, though, was they caused some noise and barricaded the stage. He could have still spoken, but he decided not to. That was his right to not speak. It was also their right to protest that. I don't believe, however, that we should be shutting down these, speakers. I think other opinions and other voices should be allowed on campus. So yeah, I think it's all right if other speakers are coming on, but you have as much a right as a student to protest as they do to speak.
I agree with most of what you said, Parker, but I don't think that we should just undeniably allow any speaker on campus, especially if they're like talking of hateful rhetoric or something that might target a specific group or of people, and not saying like either on either side of the issue. But other than that, like I agree with what you were saying with how if a speaker comes in, people should be able to protest that because that's their right to. And this also ties back to the idea of like what protesting is for and how people can show what they feel about an administration or about an establishment, and that's they're able to respond to it in that manner.
I just follow up on that by asking you, what's the aim of the university, the aim of the college? I think it's to seek truth. We don't need to relitigate the question of Nazism, racism, of sexism, to draw our path to truth. I think there's some kinds of views, Nazism being the easy one, Richard Spencer being the easy candidate, that have no place on a college campus. And so, though I understand it can be beneficial for people like that to have their rights to express this and that, at the same time, I don't see a value in campuses doing so. I don't think that the state should shut down this kind of speech, but I do think that students and faculty should challenge it in any way possible, because expressing those kinds of views do not benefit our core mission.
I'm kind of agreeing with everyone else on the panel, but I guess I have my own input on it. I believe in debate, and at its fullest sense, I believe that everyone should have the right to speak, no matter what kind of rhetoric it is. I believe that if you really are not agreeing with such rhetoric, then you do have the right to protest it, but you do not have the right to stop someone from speaking. That's your own personal choice. I also believe that if you really disagree with them, then you have a reason, and then you can be able to logically debate with them.
Let me ask, I have maybe 2 or 3 more questions, but let me ask one more question before we go to the audience questions, which I'm sure there probably will be follow-up questions, but it might lead to that. And that is really something we have very touched on, which is sort of violence and protest. I want to talk a little bit about sort of what you consider acceptable behavior and actions during protests, and more broadly asking sort of, is violent protest ever justified? If so, under what circumstances? You can bring in historical maybe examples that you would like to bring up, or even some current examples. You can even refer to the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, and fighting against the political government as an example. That's more something that comes up from the right side of the political spectrum sometimes. But the question is really about how far is too far when it comes to protests. Where do you draw the line? And again, the other question was sort of violent protest. Is it ever justified? And if so, when? I'm sure there will be some follow-up, probably thought or questions, but then I also want to bring in the audience at some point. Maybe who wants to start? No, just
I prefer not to go first.
yeah, I prefer also not to have the professor go first. One of the students will be next to.
All right.
Good.
So just to restate the question, you're asking, when is it okay to violent protest, or is it
ever justified? Yeah.
I think looking back in history, we can look at a few instances where violent protesting has gone right. The most notable coming to mind is the Tea Party going down the harbor. Doing that was a huge moment in history. But I think we've seen more success in peaceful protests than we have violent protests. Like I said, I do not believe burning down the city is at all just. You are given your First Amendment right to protest, or not your First Amendment, but you're given a right to protest, right? But those rights are null and void the second you start rioting. There's a difference between rioting and protesting. And I firmly don't believe that you should be able to riot. and call it a protest.
Well, I'm pretty much a pacifist, so I don't really enjoy violence in any capacity. But I think there are some notable protests, like from history, like Parker mentioned, Tea Party. If you look at the Stonewall riots, which I mean that was a riot, but there are a couple notable ones that definitely got an issue talked about in the spotlight, which is, I think, one of the reasons people protest is to say, hey, this is an issue. I think it's interesting, like, talking about like the difference between a protest and a riot, and a lot of times I think protests turn into riots because of police intervention, and oftentimes protests aren't meant to be violent, but then say a group is gathering and then tear gas gets thrown and there's a lot of miscommunication about what's happening, and in those cases, not saying that I think violence is justified, but if police are the ones initiating the violence, and not saying that that's always the case, but there are cases, or there's cases like with the campaigns where the FBI infiltrated and planted people there, and I think I can't give a clear answer when I think violence is okay, but I do think there are some different circumstances that allow for it.
I'm a practicing pacifist as well, so this question is considerably hard for me to answer, because as for myself, I would never actually want to raise a hand to destroy anything or hurt anyone. But again, like protests like the Stonewall riot and stuff like that, I think has like brought issues to light and actually like stood against like really like unjust things and that they work. And so I'm not saying that I can't really give a clear like line, but I just know personally I would never be able to do anything but peacefully protest.
I'll start with a story. So back when Gandhi was formulating his nonviolent protest ideas, he was faced with a man who had been accused of walking into a British colonial station house and shooting an officer on duty. People asked, all right, Gandhi, what do you think about this guy? He clearly engaged in violence. Gandhi said, look, I condemn the murder, but I do not condemn the murderer. If one is struggling for justice, any tool must be ready to do so. Gandhi himself definitely felt that nonviolence was the way to go. MLK, the same thing. MLK said that by engaging nonviolently with a situation of injustice, the system will show its justice by using violence against your body when you're doing nothing to challenge. Of course, the case, that part of the civil rights movement was the threat of violence from people like Malcolm X, who said either this gets through or violence will happen, or race war will happen. And surely it's the case that Johnson was considering that as civil rights legislation went through in a period where MLK was doing his nonviolent work. I'd point out instances like the monk of South Vietnam, lighting himself on fire. Self-immolation is a violent act. Violence is yourself, but still violence. This willingness to put your body forward, not just in having a sign up or shouting words, but instead actively sacrificing your body, putting your body on the line to have violence brought against you possibly, is a way in which you can draw a tremendous amount of attention and show that you practically care about a cause profoundly. I laud the pacifist position, and I see the arguments for it, but I think most Americans will say that violence is acceptable in cases of self-defense. It's a place where most people will go. The question then is, what is it to defend yourself? The obvious example is someone comes out with a gun, you shoot them, you fight back, whatever. But think about it, what's necessary to have a self at all? What kind of conditions must obtain for you to exist as a person? If you start asking that kind of question, it might open up a broader conception of self-defense beyond just that in-the-moment kind of situation. So I think that self-defense, a fairly broad category, is what's acceptable for violence and political actions. Do recall, American Revolution, political violence.
I assume that there will be some follow-up questions, but I want to squeeze in one more question. That I know when I talk about social media and politics, people are often very interested, students are very interested, or social media and society.